Hi. Thanks for stopping by. I don't know about you, but the quiet of this hour feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. That's why I'm here tonight, in the dark, sharing the things that kept me awake. The moments where logic just broke. These aren't campfire tales or myths I found online. These are things that actually happened to me, or people I know, that I can't explain. I don't know if it was a ghost, a glitch, or just a broken mind. You decide. I'm just telling you what I saw. Let's get into the first one. I don't expect you to believe me. It was 3 in the morning, deep in the Blackwood Ridge hiking trail, when the silence got heavy enough to feel like pressure against my ears. I'd been camping alone for the weekend, seeking the quiet, but that night the forest didn't feel empty. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to exhale. The air was still, cold, and smelled faintly of wet pine needles and something sharper, like ozone after a lightning strike. I remember looking at my watch and thinking about how odd the timing was, but I was already too deep in the woods to turn back. I had set up my tent in a small clearing about half a mile from the main trailhead, a spot I'd visited before during the summer when it was full of noise and sunlight. That night, the trees looked different. They seemed to lean inward, their branches intertwining in a way that blocked out the stars completely. I'd brought my flashlight, a heavy-duty LED that usually cut through the dark like a blade, but the beam felt weak, struggling against the gloom. As I walked back from checking the perimeter, I noticed my footprints. They were fresh, but they didn't match my stride. They were smaller, and the heels were dragged slightly, as if whoever or whatever made them was being pulled forward rather than walking. I told myself it was just a trick of the light and the moon's angle, that my brain was playing games after hours of silence. I went back to the tent, ate a cold granola bar, and tried to sleep, telling myself I was just overthinking. The first sound was a low hum, vibrating through the canvas of the tent, like a distant engine that had no source. I sat up, flashlight in hand, and shone it at the tent flap. Nothing but the trees. Then, the hum stopped, replaced by the sound of dry leaves crunching right outside the entrance. I froze, holding my breath. I waited a minute, then pulled the flap open a crack. The ground outside was empty, but the footprints I had seen earlier were gone, and in their place were a series of new marks. They were deep, like heavy boots, but they moved in a jerky, unnatural rhythm, stepping from one spot to the next without ever lifting the foot fully off the ground. I convinced myself it was a deer or a small bear, maybe injured, and that the moon was casting long shadows that distorted the way they looked. I locked the tent flap and turned on the radio, but the static was the only thing coming through, and the voice on the static sounded like it was whispering my name. The static stopped abruptly, and the wind picked up, howling through the pines with a voice that sounded almost like human speech. I grabbed my pack, desperate to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if I was wading through deep water. I stumbled out of the tent and into the clearing. The trees were moving now. Not swaying in the wind, but rotating slowly on their own trunks, turning their trunks toward me. The ground was covered in a layer of ash that hadn't been there before, and my boots crunched with a sound like breaking bones. I saw a shape standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and thin, its head tilted at an impossible angle. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, pale surface that reflected the moonlight in a way that hurt my eyes. It took a step toward me, and the sound of its movement wasn't the crunch of boots on leaves, but a wet, tearing sound, like fabric ripping in a damp room. I tried to scream, but my throat was gone, replaced by a void of silence. The thing reached out, its fingers stretching out like long, black wires, and touched my forehead. It didn't hurt, but it felt like my mind was being peeled back, layer by layer, until I could see everything that was wrong with the world. I woke up the next morning in my car, parked on the side of the road miles away from the trailhead. My tent was still pitched, but the trees around it were gone, replaced by a flat, empty field of gray dirt. I checked my phone, and the GPS showed I had been at the campsite for 12 hours, even though I had only been there for a few minutes in my memory. My tent was untouched, but when I pulled back the flap to look inside, the granola bar I had eaten was gone, and in its place was a small, wet patch of ash on the floor of the tent. I drove home immediately, but every time I pass that stretch of road, I can smell the scent of wet pine and ozone, and I can hear the sound of leaves crunching just outside the window, even though I'm in my living room. I don't expect you to believe me, but I've been trying to tell myself for 3 years that it was just a dream I was too scared to wake up from. It happened in my childhood bedroom, the one with the slanted ceiling and the window that never quite latched right. It was a Tuesday night in November, just past midnight. The rain was drumming against the glass, a steady, rhythmic sound that usually helped me sleep. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling fan, waiting for the storm to pass. That was the last normal thing I remember. For as long as I can remember, my room had been my sanctuary. It was a small space, painted a faded lavender that my mother had chosen for me before she realized how dark it looked at night. I had a habit of leaving the closet door slightly ajar, just a crack, because my dad always said it let the draft out. I also had a rule about the closet light: I never turned it on. The bulb burned out years ago, and replacing it felt like an unnecessary chore. There was one other thing, something I tried to ignore until it became a constant low-level hum in the back of my mind. There was a distinct, hollow tap sound that came from inside the closet, usually right after the wind died down. I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe a loose pipe in the wall behind the door. It sounded like someone gently tapping a knuckle against the inside of a drywall cavity, but only once. Just once. I convinced myself it was the wind catching the loose latch again. Then the tapping started happening more often. First, it was once an hour, then once a minute. It wasn't just a tap anymore, it sounded like a slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails dragging against the wood paneling. I would get up, heart hammering, and throw the door open to the empty closet, shining my phone flashlight into the dark corners. There was nothing there, just my winter coats and the old suitcase I never unpacked. I started sleeping with the door fully closed, wedging a chair under the handle. The next night, I woke up to the sound of the chair scraping against the floor, sliding back into place on its own. I told myself I was sleepwalking, that the chair had just fallen. But the next morning, the chair was positioned perfectly straight, as if it had been gently pushed back. The scratching got louder, closer to the door. It wasn't frantic anymore, it was patient. I could hear breathing on the other side of the wood, heavy and wet, right against the gap where the door met the frame. I grabbed the baseball bat from under my bed, my hands shaking so hard I could barely lift it. The breathing stopped, but the scratching didn't. It was inside the door now, right behind the paint. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, the bat raised, waiting for the door to open. The silence was so heavy it felt like pressure against my ears. Then, the doorknob began to turn. I knew the handle had been broken for years, I had tried to fix it myself with a hammer and a screwdriver. It turned anyway. The door swung inward, slowly, creaking on the hinges that shouldn't have been moving. I swung the bat, screaming, but I hit nothing but the darkness inside. The light from my phone flickered and died. In the absolute blackness, I felt a hand wrap around my ankle, cold and dead, and then I was dragged. Not pulled, but dragged. I felt the rough texture of the floor against my face, sliding backward into the closet. I could smell dust and old rain, but underneath that, the scent of wet dog. I kicked and screamed, but the grip was iron. The door slammed shut, and the sound of the chair being pushed back into place echoed from the other side. I'm sitting in this apartment now, 3 states away, in a room with a lock on the door that I check every night. I never slept there again. The police came, and my mother was terrified, asking if I had nightmares. I told them I had a break-in, but they found nothing. The police said the chair was knocked over by a draft, and the door handle was just loose. But there is one thing they can't explain. When I moved out, I found the old suitcase in the closet. Inside, wrapped in an old wool blanket, were the keys to my childhood home. They were wet, soaked in water, and covered in dirt. They weren't just wet, they were muddy, as if they had been pulled out of a pond. I've kept them in a drawer, but I still hear that tapping sound sometimes, right through the floorboards, even though I live on the 4th floor. And sometimes, when I think no one is watching, I see a small, wet patch of dirt on the top of my own dresser, shaped exactly like a handprint. I don't expect you to believe me. It started last Tuesday, around 1:15 a.m., on the service road behind the old textile factory on 4th Street. The kind of place where the streetlights flicker like dying breath and the only sound is the hum of the high-voltage lines overhead. I was walking home from a late shift at the diner, my sneakers crunching on the gravel, thinking the world was empty and quiet. I should have known better. I had walked this same stretch of asphalt 1,000 times. The yellow stripe on the left edge was cracked in a specific zigzag pattern, the brick wall on the right was covered in a layer of soot, and the rusted chain-link fence always creaked when the wind hit it. It was just a shortcut. I was tired, my shoulders were heavy, and I just wanted to get to the corner store for a coffee. That's when I noticed the first thing. There were tire tracks in the mud near the fire hydrant, fresh and deep, leading away from the alley and then stopping abruptly right in the middle of the road. I thought maybe a delivery truck had passed through, but there were no headlights from any vehicle for miles. The tracks ended exactly where the light from the next pole was too dim to see clearly, and I told myself it was just a neighbor moving furniture, or a mechanic checking a car. I kept walking, my breath visible in the cold air, but the silence felt heavier than usual, like the air itself was holding its breath. By the time I reached the second streetlight, the tracks had changed. There were footprints now, muddy and bare, stepping right on top of the tire marks. They were small, too small for a grown man, but the stride was long, almost unnaturally so. I told myself it was a kid, a prankster, someone playing a game. I walked faster, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs, but I kept my eyes on the ground. Then I saw the handprints on the fence. Not smudged or accidental, but pressed hard against the metal, leaving dark, wet smears on the rusted links. I turned around to check behind me, but there was nothing but the empty street stretching back to the diner. When I turned back to the road, the footprints had moved closer to my heels, and there was a third set now, larger and heavier, walking just behind the small ones. I started to run, the gravel crunching loudly, but the sound stopped the moment I picked up speed. The silence returned, absolute and suffocating, and I could feel the air pressure drop around my ears. I skidded to a halt when I hit the corner of the alley, the one with the broken gate. That was when I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the road, facing away from me, wearing a gray hoodie that looked soaked with rain, even though the sky had been clear for hours. He was still. He didn't turn around when I called out, didn't flinch when I dropped my bag of groceries. Then, slowly, he began to turn. His head rotated, not like a person, but like a camera on a broken mount, until his face was visible. There was no face, just a smooth patch of skin where features should be, but the air around his head shimmered like heat waves off asphalt. He took a step toward me, and his feet didn't touch the ground, hovering inches above the mud. I screamed, but my voice didn't come out, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. The streetlights flickered and died, leaving us in total darkness, and I felt something cold wrap around my ankle, not a hand, but a shadow, a physical weight that pulled me down into the mud. I woke up in my bed at 3 a.m., gasping for air, my legs trembling so violently I could barely stand. I checked the door, the windows, the locks. Everything was normal. I went to the bathroom to splash water on my face, looking for signs of the encounter, but there was nothing. No mud on my shoes, no dirt under my fingernails, no bruise on my ankle. I went back to sleep, trying to tell myself it was just a nightmare, stress, exhaustion. But the next morning, I walked out to my front porch and saw it. There was a single, fresh handprint on the wood of the railing, right where I had been sitting. It wasn't wet, and it wasn't muddy. It was just a dark, permanent mark, and it was shaped exactly like the hand of the thing that had pulled me down. I washed it, but it came back darker, right where I had tried to scrub it away. Now, every time I walk down that service road, the air feels colder, and I can hear the sound of footsteps, but I never see anyone. I just know they're there, waiting for me to stop looking at the ground. That's all I have for tonight. It's strange how the mind plays tricks on us, isn't it? But if you've ever had an experience that defies logic, something you can't quite put a name to, I'd really like to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. Sometimes we're not alone in these things. We've got another batch of stories ready for next time, some of which are even harder to explain than this one. If you want to stay, just subscribe. I'll see you in the dark.